Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this press conference. Today we have with us Mr. Saul, who is a Special Rapporteur on Counter-Terrorism. We will begin with opening remarks from the Special Rapporteur, after which we will begin and open up the floor to questions. With that, I hand over to Mr. Saul.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to launch my first report as Special Rapporteur before the Human Rights Council today. Regrettably, my report documents that the past 2 decades of prolific global counter-terrorism efforts have not been matched by an equally robust commitment to human rights. Counter-terrorism measures are strewn with human rights violations, including unlawful killings, arbitrary detention, torture, unfair trial, privacy breaches from mass surveillance, and the criminalisation of freedoms of expression, assembly, association, and political participation. This misuse of counter-terrorism measures not only violates the rights of suspected criminals, but can also jeopardise the rights of the innocent. In many places, there has been a rampant weaponisation of overly broad terrorism definitions and offences against civil society, against human rights defenders, activists, political opponents, journalists, minorities and students. Counter-terrorism financing measures have restricted legitimate non-profit activities and impeded humanitarian relief. Unjustified states of emergency continue to undermine human rights. Excessive military violence in response to terrorism also destroys human rights, including through violations of international humanitarian law and international criminal law. States use violence across borders, even when it is not justified under the international law of self-defence. Many states have also failed to seriously address the root causes of terrorism, including the state's own violations of human rights, and impunity for these state violations is endemic and is driving more grievance and more violence. My first report today announces my priorities over the next 3 years. These include ensuring that regional organisations respect human rights when countering terrorism, that coercive administrative measures to prevent terrorism comply with human rights, that non-state actors involved in counter-terrorism respect human rights, including technology, finance, security companies, armed groups and non-profits, that new technologies to counter-terrorism are effectively regulated, including spyware, facial recognition, artificial intelligence. I'm keen to ensure that states are held accountable for large-scale violations of human rights resulting from counter-terrorism. And then finally, that victims of terrorism also receive full and effective remedies. Over the next 3 years, I'll also continue the efforts of my predecessor on preventing the abuse of counter-terrorism against civil society, protecting the 70,000 people still arbitrarily detained in northeast Syria, in the context of the war against Islamic State, protecting detainees and transferees from detention at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and ensuring that the United Nations itself, through all of its counter-terrorism bodies and other agencies, safeguards human rights in its counter-terrorism work. So in the current climate, human rights in counter-terrorism are at increased risk because of rising authoritarianism, surging domestic polarisation and extremism, geopolitical competition, dysfunction in the Security Council, and new tools including social media for fueling dehumanisation, vilification, incitement and misinformation. Double standards by major powers in the enforcement of human rights is also eroding public confidence in the credibility of the international system. States also must do better in funding the protection of human rights in counter-terrorism. So my message in conclusion is to urge all states to move beyond the dominant rhetorical commitment to human rights and to instead place them at the heart of all of their counter-terrorism measures. Respecting human rights not only makes counter-terrorism more legitimate, it also makes it more effective because publics have confidence that states are using their counter-terrorism measures in accordance with law and with full respect for all individuals affected. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Saul. The Special Rapporteur will now take questions. Please state your name and the outlet you work for before asking your question. We'll begin with the questions from the room and then move on to those of you joining us online. Thank you. I see no hands in the room, so we'll start with Yuri Aprelev from RIA Novosti online. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you for taking my question and thank you for this briefing. I have two questions. The first one is about what you say just now, that the double standards of the great powers with regard to the application of human rights erode confidence in international law. What countries are you talking about exactly? Because this is not something, which great powers, to be more clearly, are you talking about? In your report, you mentioned the fact that the place of the USA in the world has allowed them to seriously violate international law without consequences for them. Is this the kind of double standards you regret? Can we say that after September 11, the United States torpedoed the very principle of international law in its war against terrorism, still in force today, with drone strikes against sovereign states without any mandate from the Security Council, numerous civilian casualties following these strikes, and the occupation of territories as still today in Syria and Iraq? And do you think that the situation in Gaza today is the consequences of the US policy, which the US is also covering in the Security Council, because Israel is saying that the war in Gaza is against the terroristic organization? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so this is a thematic report, so it's not a report about the performance of any particular countries. So it's a more general observation about what's happened, I think, over the last 20 years in terms of countering terrorism. I wouldn't say it's limited to any particular great power. I mean, I think we've seen behavior by a large number of powerful states, including all members, frankly, of the Security Council, who over time have not respected human rights in their operations. That includes their foreign military operations against terrorism. It includes domestic legal measures to counter terrorism through regular law enforcement and so on. But the point about all of this is that it does fuel further polarization and discontent because certain states are seen to be thwarting the will of the majority of the international community to implement and enforce international law. 5 states on the Security Council have a veto, right? So they have the capacity to do good in using their power under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter to prevent situations involving terrorism or other violence from escalating, or they can exercise their vetoes to stop international action. And there are so many examples of that, not only in a counter-terrorism context. In relation to Gaza, look, I and other special rapporteurs have consistently called on all parties in that conflict to respect international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international criminal law. It's clear that on October 7 and subsequently there were very grave violations of international law by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. That continues today in the form of ongoing hostage-taking as well as occasional rocket fire after September 11, indiscriminate, not targeting military objectives, likely to strike civilians and therefore constitute war crimes. The Israeli response, of course, has also not complied with its obligations under international humanitarian law. We've consistently highlighted that Israel has not exercised the level of care in the protection of civilians required by international humanitarian law. That's manifest in, at a minimum, disproportionate attacks which cause excessive civilian casualties relative to the military advantage. indiscriminate attacks which don't sufficiently differentiate between military targets and civilians, through, for example, the dropping of very large unguided munitions in densely populated urban areas, and large numbers of the munitions, a large proportion of the munitions used by Israel have fallen into that category. Failure to warn civilians, denial of humanitarian relief, consequential likely starvation of the civilian population, arbitrary forced displacement, not providing the necessary humanitarian conditions during displacement. So look, there have been lots of very well documented violations by Israel. That's not to say that all of Israel's violence is unlawful, and certainly Israel has been taking certain steps in the targeting process and seeking legal advice and so on. But the overwhelming impression is that these are not isolated cases of violations, but there is a kind of systematic non-compliance in relation to both the protection of civilians in the conduct of hostilities, so in targeting, but also in the denial of humanitarian relief necessary to sustain over 2.3 million people in Gaza, many of whom have been forced to the verge of starvation.
Thank you, Mr. Saul. So we'll take the next question from Mr. Antonio Broto from EFE. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like you to elaborate a little more on the use of anti-terrorist legislation to arrest political dissidents in some countries, and if you can give some examples of that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So my predecessor wrote a major global study on the misuse of counter-terrorism laws against civil society. So she found that it's not an issue confined to a particular or small number of countries. This is something which is endemic in many parts of the world, and it encompasses a broad range of civil society. I mean, it's not just political dissidents. It's climate activists or human rights defenders or students or in some cases lawyers and even judges. It's the use of counterterrorism financing laws to shut down or restrict the lawful operation of non-government organizations of all kinds, religious, charitable, humanitarian, etc. So we issue individual communications, and we have on the United Nations Human Rights Database a long list of precisely these kinds of cases where counterterrorism laws have been abused against all kinds of different categories. In my dialogue with states this morning, for example, the case of Tunisia came up, where emergency laws and decrees in Tunisia have been used essentially to sack judges and pursue charges and imprisonment against judges for just doing their job as officers of the court, and these are kind of sackings on a mass basis, large numbers of people subject to these kinds of legal proceedings. So there are so many of these cases that this is precisely why it's so alarming, because there isn't any kind of concerted pushback from the international community to bring pressure to bear on these states to reverse this kind of misuse. The messaging from much of the international community has been states must be tough on terrorists and repress terrorism, but I think the pendulum has swung much too far in favor of repression without sufficiently balancing the protection of human rights by state officials.
Thank you. The next question, Ms. Catherine Fiankambo-Konga, please.
Yes, good morning. My name is Catherine Fiancamp-Bokonga, France 24, French international TV. In the list of people you mentioned that have been victims of the misuse of counterterrorism, I think you forgot journalists. So I'd like to hear a bit more on that issue, particularly as you know, in the context of September 11th, everything started that in the name of conducting, in fighting terrorism, states started to conduct surveillance on journalists, wiretapping journalists, monitoring journalists, and also arresting individuals. So what do you have to say on that? And also if you could highlight a little bit more the aspects in European countries.
Yes, so look, I do mention journalists in my report, and I think I did mention it in opening remarks as well. That's a very important category that has come under pressure from counterterrorism laws. You know, in the dialogue this morning, the case of Jimmy Lai came up, for example, a proprietor of a major independent news outlet in Hong Kong, China, who has been arrested and charged on national security offences, essentially as a way of shutting down the operation of the independent media. So this is not an uncommon occurrence. You mentioned spyware. And of course, that's been a great concern in many countries. This, secret use of spyware, which through tracking journalists and so on, can expose sources and lead to reprisals against those sources as well. One of the problems is a lack of effective international and national regulation of these kinds of technologies, coupled with private companies who make this software, make these programs, themselves not being very good at doing human rights due diligence in the kinds of products that they produce and sell to different actors around the world. So my mandate is very focused on trying to come up with options for stronger international regulation of those kinds of new technologies which are routinely used against journalists. In some situations, of course, there's been the direct targeting of journalists. So certain countries are well known for having for being very dangerous places for journalists, and that's not just in active conflict zones. We have seen certain states seemingly deliberately targeting media workers, including in recent conflicts. And then, of course, censorship and online moderation. I mean, there are lots of interferences with the freedom of the media to report on its on all kinds of matters of public affairs because of restrictions on extremist speech or praising, glorifying, advocating terrorism, etc. These have made it quite a difficult environment for states to operate in. I'd also mentioned non-traditional media. So one case, which of course has been of concern in the media, is the case of Julian Assange, and that's a case which the WikiLeaks publisher. That's a case which my mandate is watching closely as that trial moves closer in the current extradition proceeding between the UK and the US.
Thank you. We have a question in the room.
Hi, Phoenix TV from Hong Kong. I have a question that the hot topic it was after 9/11 during the 10 years, the issue counter-terrorist was still on the hot topic. But why now you launch this kind of report? Is that a good momentum? Thank you.
Sorry, I'm not. Could you just clarify your question? I'm not quite sure what you're asking.
My question, the timing. What's the timing to launch your report now? Thank you.
Well, to explain, I've just been appointed, so it's my job to write reports, and I write 2 a year, so one to the Human Rights Council, one to the General Assembly, and so that explains the timing. I think though it's also quite a useful moment to reflect on the last 2 decades, right, of counterterrorism law. I mean. Initially, after 9/11, there was a huge rush to make legislation. There was then a kind of second wave after ISIS emerged in 2012-13, and new issues like foreign fighters emerged. And people often thought after these kind of initial tranches of legislative activism, things would kind of settle down, and if countries went too far, that laws would be dialed back. I don't think that's happened in many parts of the world. I mean, I think what we have seen is the UN Security Council has been constantly pushing states to adopt new counterterrorism measures consistently over the last 2 decades. And so more and more measures are piled on at the national level, and that happens. Regardless, so the Security Council requires all countries to adopt these counterterrorism measures, regardless of whether a particular country has an effective rule of law system, whether it has an independent judiciary, whether it respects and safeguards human rights. And I think that's actually an incredibly dangerous thing for the United Nations to keep doing when there's no internationally agreed definition of terrorism. The UN counterterrorism bodies are continuing to require states to adopt laws regardless of their history of misusing existing counterterrorism laws, and regardless of often a dire lack of effective human rights safeguards to control those measures and push back against them, and to ensure that the state's use of those powers, the state can be held accountable for those kinds of misuses. We've then seen, in addition to terrorism, this new concept of violent extremism being used as well in many countries. It's also undefined, and yet the UN is requiring states to take measures to respond to those as well. And it's, in a perfect world, if a state has a great human rights and rule of law system, then, maybe counterterrorism laws would work in a manner consistent with human rights. But that's not the world. That's not the world in most parts of it. Well, in certainly a majority of countries around the world. And even those countries with really effective legal systems still have serious human rights compliance problems in relation to counterterrorism. So I do think it's been, although the Security Council has paid more attention to human rights over the years, it has often been fairly rhetorical, and it hasn't been matched by specific requirements on states to do certain things to protect human rights, or the funding of human rights in that process of countering terrorism.
Thank you, Mr. Saul. There's a follow-up question online from Ms. Catherine Fiancon-Bokonga.
Yes. Thank you for giving me the floor again. Sir, I'd like you to come back please, on what you said, you mentioned previously to my question. I'd like to see a little bit more what the recommendations that you've formulated towards, I would say, Europe and European countries, because P5 are often under the spotlight, and other specific countries that are in conflict. But for instance, in France, we had some journalists that have been taped, followed in the name of state security. What kind of recommendation have you mentioned? And also, what about your cooperation with the EU or with parliamentaries? Thank you.
Great, thank you for the question. And look, just to clarify, this report is so I've been in the job 3 months, and the first report is always setting out priorities for the next 3 years. So this report itself does not yet have recommendations on any particular issues. It's more scoping what I'm going to do as the job gets going over the next 3 years. So it is a little bit early to have recommendations on any substantive issues. Having said that, we of course. One part of the role of a special rapporteur is to receive and address what we call individual communications to states. They can be complaints we receive from victims of state violations of human rights, or they can be assessments we conduct of counter-terrorism laws, policies, practices in a particular government, in a particular country. So that's in part a reactive process. So if people in France want to bring complaints to the office, they're welcome to do that, and that's then the context in which we can engage with the state. Or if there's, let's say, new legislation or old legislation which is being used problematically in a new way, then we can also take that up with the particular country. So would absolutely encourage you, if you have concerns about the treatment of journalists in France, for example, or in other European countries, then that would be the usual way in which we would address those issues. In terms of the EU, yes. So my first report to the General Assembly in October will be about the role of regional organisations in countering terrorism and the extent to which they respect human rights in the kinds of measures, laws, etc., that they adopt. So the EU and the Council of Europe, are the two, as well as OSCE, are bodies in Europe which we will be looking at closely in that context to assess how well they've been doing in respecting human rights. It'll also cover regional organisations from all kinds of other regions around the world as well. In terms of parliaments, we would engage parliaments in the context usually of draft legislation or new bills. So if we're concerned about the development of particular new legislation, a good example is the Hong Kong National Security Law, which is in draft form at the moment, then that's a kind of point at which we could make a submission or brief parliamentarians. Today, for example, I'm briefing parliamentarians in the United Kingdom about UK arms transfers to Israel in relation to the war in Gaza, because we have taken a position that we think continuing to export weapons and ammunition to Israel, given the clear risk of the use of those weapons in violations of international humanitarian law in Gaza, means that states exporting those weapons would themselves be violating their duty under international humanitarian law to ensure respect for humanitarian law by other states, and that means by not exporting arms to them, which would enable further violations to take place. So yes, we dialogue with parliamentarians and we engage formally on legislative proposals as well.
Thank you. There's a question from Mr. John Zarokostas.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm asking this question for one of my outlets, The Lancet, the medical journal. I was wondering, Professor, in your research, have you come across situations where member states have very good legislation on their statutes concerning counter-terrorism and etc., and at the same time they're exporting mechanisms that are used to torture people that are alleged to fall into the category of extremists or alleged terrorists? Thank you.
Just to clarify the question, so exporting, by exporting you mean like deporting or extraditing people to other countries to be tortured? Is that the question?
No, exporting equipment that is used for torture. In a lot of the cases, there's not much transparency on the charges. They're incognito, they're in so-called black sites, etc. So on the one hand, there's very good legislation on the Torture Convention, but at the same time, you've got parallel universe.
Yeah, thank you. Good question. And look, certainly the bigger issue of rendition of torture of terrorism suspects to other countries has been well covered by the mandate in the past. But on the key part of your question, I'd refer you to my colleague, the Special Rapporteur on Torture, who released her thematic report last week at the Human Rights Council, which was precisely devoted to this question of torture equipment, material, all the different things, tools, which states export to one another in a law enforcement context, and which can be used in torture or cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment, other ill treatment in detention. So that's the most up to date source of thinking about that question.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Mr. Nick Cumming-Bruce from the New York Times.
Yeah, thank you for taking this question. You talked about the strong drift away from human rights in counterterrorism practice internationally. I wondered what your view of the role of the UN counterterrorism mechanisms in this might have been. It's grown quite exponentially in recent years, largely with the support of governments that have a bad human rights record. And I wonder if you think it's been instrumentalized by them to kind of help shift essentially the standard of counterterrorism practice away from human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question, and yes, absolutely. The counterterrorism mechanisms have grown enormously in recent years. I mean, there used to be the Security Council sanctions committees plus the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate and Counterterrorism Committee monitoring implementation of the Security Council resolutions. But then in 2017, the UN Office of Counterterrorism was added and has grown exponentially, as you say. And then, of course, UN Office of Drugs and Crime has always been there in Vienna. But also this other mechanism of the UN Global Compact on Counterterrorism, of which I'm a member, along with 46 other UN mainly entities and a few others. And they have a bunch of working groups which focus on a whole range of specific issues. Lots of technical assistance, capacity building, standard setting being driven by those bodies. And then, of course, the UN Counterterrorism Centre, part of the Office of Counterterrorism now as well. Look, it's on influence of donors. It's a difficult question to give a simple answer to. I mean, yes, by giving money, states, this is in any context, states may feel like they get something out of that in terms of self-interest, whether that's limited to a kind of legitimization of their positive role in supporting multilateralism, or whether they want something more than that, i.e. they want to control operationally the direction of what these counterterrorism bodies do, their priorities, etc. I just don't have, and I'm only 3 months into the job, I just don't have enough of a sense yet of to what extent, when they give this money, they then have control over how it is spent and directed, at the kind of project and operational level, or whether the money's given, and then there's sufficient kind of structural independence within the organisation for the organisation to make up its own mind about where those resources are allocated, what kinds of issues are worked on, and so on. I wouldn't say it's an issue limited to money. I mean, of course, even if you don't give money, sometimes certain states might have a senior UN official in a top job in one of these agencies. Different countries on a rotating basis chair the Counter-Terrorism Committee and therefore have a certain level of control over what those bodies do. So there are lots of points of political influence, in a politicized multilateral system. But I think it's absolutely the right question to ask. If a small number of donors is giving the majority of the money in the system, that should always raise questions about who has influence in the kind of work that those bodies are doing.
Thank you, Mr. Saul. We have a question in the room.
Thank you for taking my question. Maeva Chabrier from Kyodo News, the Japanese news agency here at the UN. I just have a question regarding the situation in Switzerland. As you know, there were like a terrorist attack in Zurich, considered as a terrorist attack, so the knife attack on the Orthodox Jew by a 15-year-old boy, Tunisian and Swiss, and the idea has been raised to rip off his nationality. So in that case, would you consider that it would be like, again, the human rights? What's your opinion on that case? Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, so international law says a few things about this. I mean, if it would make a person stateless, actually, or de facto, then I think that is clearly a problem. If this boy has a second, nationality at present, Tunisia, then there are then still other human rights questions about is it safe to return the person to Tunisia? What does it mean in terms of impact on family rights if he has an established family here? And I don't know the facts of this case. Are there risks of ill treatment, etc., on return to Tunisia? Knowing what we know about the state of the legal system there, which is has lost any kind of semblance of independence, rule of law in the last couple of years because of the state of emergency decrees there. Being a child, obviously that what's in the best interests of the child plays into that consideration as well. Is the process for stripping citizenship respectful of procedural rights, due process, judicial safeguards, etc. And then, I would say just on the security front, look, it is a discretion of states, ultimately. This is the international law system we have. It's a discretion of states who they confer nationality on and deprive nationality of. And as long as it's not done arbitrarily, without due process, etc., then it is permitted under international law. But I would say, in terms of the underlying security question, I do think that if a person has lived in a country for a good period of time, might have stronger links to the country they're currently in than the one they might have some other nationality of, then I do think it just in terms of effectiveness of prosecution, effectiveness of rehabilitation, reintegration, de-radicalization, all these kinds of processes, it does make security sense in containing whatever risk that person might still pose in the future, to do all of that in the country where they have the strongest links, because that's where they'll be supported by family. It's where they might have social connections and speak the language. And I mean, in this context of citizenship stripping, we have seen lots of cases where people have lived all their life in one country, and suddenly, because they've got some formal nationality of another country, they're deported to that country where they've got no links. That country might not have effective law enforcement. It might have a weak system for dealing with the threat, and I do see that as exporting your security problem to another country that isn't well equipped to deal with that. So I think we should be very careful about stripping citizenship. I don't think it's a security solution, and often it's not human rights compliant.
Thank you. The next question is from Mr. Musa Assi.
Thank you very much for taking my question. Israel says is fighting in Gaza, fighting the terrorist group in Gaza. What is your opinion about that? And are you considering Hamas like a terrorist organization? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Look, there is no internationally accepted definition of terrorism, so I don't have an international law basis myself for determining who is or isn't terrorist. Hamas is also not on the Security Council's list of terrorist organizations. Now, having said all of that, of course, what has happened is that the Security Council, as we mentioned, has required all countries to take measures to prevent and suppress terrorism. By not adopting a definition, it's then essentially allowed each country around the world to make up its own definition of terrorism and to apply that to different actors. And sometimes that's is clearly abusive. Other times it's more difficult to tell. In terms of my mandate, I've got a mandate from the Human Rights Council to monitor states' compliance with human rights whenever they determine that an actor is terrorist. So I don't have to take a position on whether I think Hamas is terrorist or not. That's not relevant to the power I've been entrusted with by the United Nations. But what I can do is, as soon as a state calls a group terrorist or classifies it as terrorist legally, then that engages my role in ensuring that that state respects human rights in any of the actions it takes to counter that group. So it's a protective function, right? So even if groups are not strictly or genuinely terrorist, there's still a level of international protection of human rights in that campaign against the group nominated by a state. Look, on Hamas specifically, the international definition problem, of course, part of that debate still, and there's a treaty being negotiated in the General Assembly since 2001. It's been going on for 2 decades, reflects this ongoing division for at least the last century between states over issues like, can you call a self-determination movement or a liberation movement terrorist or not? Should terrorist offences apply in situations of armed conflict or not? Or should we just leave that to be regulated by international humanitarian law, war crimes, etc.? Why is it necessary to call a group or a person terrorist if, when they murder civilians, it's already the war crime of murdering civilians? Now, some states would say the reason is because terrorism law gives you extra powers which humanitarian law doesn't give you. So humanitarian law forbids you from doing certain things. It makes certain things war crimes, but it doesn't necessarily give you these other powers, to ban an organization, to criminalize its membership, to crack down on its financing, to exercise all kinds of special investigative and surveillance powers. So terrorism law can give you extra stuff which humanitarian law doesn't necessarily give you. And I'd point in particular to what we call preparatory terrorism offences. So in relation to war crimes, if you commit a war crime or you aid or assist somebody to commit a war crime, that attracts criminal liability. All of that happens in relation to terrorism as well. But in addition, terrorism law often also makes an offence to, finance a terrorist group or to associate with terrorists or to be a member of a terrorist organisation. All things which are generally not offences in respect of war crimes or genocide or other international crimes. So on Hamas, look, some states call it terrorist and ban it as terrorist. Most states in the world have not done that. Security Council has not listed it. So the question is, depending on what is the national definition of terrorism in any given country, does what Hamas is doing or has done fit that definition in national law?
Thank you, Esther. I think Mr. Assi has a follow-up.
Yes, thank you. Some organizations and states consider the Israeli attack against civilians in Gaza like a terrorist attack. How you see that? What is your opinion about these accusations? Thanks.
As I mentioned, there's no international definition of terrorism, so we have no international legal standard from terrorism law to apply to what Israel is doing. Certainly, under international humanitarian law, there's already a very comprehensive legal framework for dealing with violence by any party, state or non-state, in armed conflict. So if, for example, a party is deliberately targeting civilians, causing disproportionate civilian casualties, launching indiscriminate attacks which harm civilians, or deliberately attack civilian infrastructure, buildings, etc., and it's not justified as an attack on a military objective, then all of those things are already illegal under international law. They're already war crimes under international law. So calling it terrorism, in terms of the outcome, it doesn't make a legal difference. It could make a difference in terms of political labeling, etc. Is it? And then you have to ask the question, is it worse to call someone a terrorist than a war criminal, right? People might have different views on that. I think war criminals are pretty bad. That's already a pretty, it's an international crime. Terrorism is not an international crime, by the way. So calling something a crime against humanity, genocide or war crimes is actually the worst thing you can call somebody in terms of the gravity of legal accusation. So terrorism, doesn't necessarily add much to that. Having said that, what I would say is under international humanitarian law, there is actually a specific war crime of intentionally spreading terror amongst a civilian population. So it's a form of deliberate attack on civilians. It has been prosecuted in a number of previous contexts. So Sierra Leone, in Sarajevo, in Bosnia. If a party to an armed conflict deliberately, so it's already a crime to deliberately attack and kill civilians, but it's also separately an additional crime to deliberately attack civilians for the purpose of inflicting severe psychological suffering, extreme fear, to terrorize them psychologically. So quite apart from the underlying physical killings, the international community has said it's also a separate wrong, which should be recognized in a separate war crime, to attack civilians in such a way that you terrorize the population as a whole. So in Sarajevo, it was deliberately targeting, cemeteries and funeral processions and cafes and restaurants and public transport and people queuing at food or water points and so on, to try to intimidate civilians and make them feel that resistance on the side of the defenders of the besieged city of Sarajevo is futile and you should give up. Likewise in Sierra Leone, it was a campaign by armed groups of deliberate mutilation of civilians, hacking off limbs, and sexual violence against women, designed to terrorize and intimidate the civilian population. So obviously you would need evidence of that in the case of Gaza. Is Israel just being careless and tolerating, high levels of civilian casualties, which is already illegal under international law, or are they deliberately attacking civilian infrastructure, civilians, in order to terrorize the population as a whole? That's not an argument I've seen made legally so far. I think for the reason I gave earlier, that war crimes, crimes against humanity, already comprehensively cover everything that Israel is accused of doing.
Thank you, Mr. Saul. If there are no further questions, we'll now close this press conference. Thank you very much for joining us.